Good evening. We'll just get rolling. If you have any others, roll in. Tonight is a class portion. As we mentioned, next week we're going to have a work day. Try to get things spruced a little better before next month. We'll probably do the same thing next month, I'm thinking possibly. And so I was trying to figure out what we were going to do, having wrapped the series on how we got the Bible, which took up most of the year. Leaves me like one this month, maybe one next month, maybe a couple in December. December is always kind of, people are in and out. I didn't want to start anything too major until the first of the year. I have some thoughts about that. So I wanted to do something just a little more, not low key, but a little lighter. Well, it doesn't have to be lighter. You just got a whole bunch of information like blah at you with the last one. I thought about digging into a bit of a how to study class, but that's a little heavier. I might do that at a different time. What I want to do this evening is a little more interactive. Notice there's a blank canvas up there, the equivalent of a whiteboard. I have some things on here, but you're going to need to be involved in this process. If you're not, it's going to be really quiet. Okay? What we're going to do basically is I have a couple of them lined up. If we get through one, great. We get through two, great. Look at a couple of texts. Ones that sometimes, and I pulled these, they're both from the first three actually, from Matthew. That wasn't intentional. What I want to do is look at them as you would beginning a study. The process involved in how you approach a particular text, and get back to what do you start with when you're wanting to sit and do Bible study? What are the things you ask? What are the things that you do? The reality is there are a lot of things that we do with the written word in other contexts all the time without thinking. But sometimes when we're confronted with the Bible, because of the fact that we're separated in time, we're separated in culture, we're separated in certain elements, especially if you go into the Old Testament, then it's covenants, that some people, and I'm meaning this in the broad sense, I'm not trying to touch on any particular person or anyone's, people can have find it challenging, or it's different than just reading something else. Of course, it's inspired, it's special. But in terms of, for lack of a better term, literature, I'm not trying to lower the Bible that way. The way we interact with the written word, there are things we usually do that come naturally, that if you think about it, work with that as well. If you're reading a novel, of course, fiction is fiction, it's not real. But it usually follows a certain pattern. It follows a certain flow. You understand how characters work. You understand how the interactions are. You understand who is involved with speaking to whom and so forth. History. If you read an account of a historical event that happened, just a recorded history, you understand events happen and they're recorded and they flow this thing. And we don't usually think too much about it. We just kind of accept how it flows. And then there are people that run to the Bible and they'll take one verse and they'll expound it to something way beyond what it was supposed to be as a piece of the written word in context, in a place, right? So if we were to look at a text, if you want to turn to or be near or follow along in Matthew 10, the first one we're going to look at is verses 19 and 20 of Matthew 10. But before we jump into that particular piece, I just want to list some things that are some kind of starting areas. Like, if you were to get the most basic level, trying to figure out what's going on, you ask, let's see. Well, maybe 5 Qs is the best word. The basic questions, they're actually the 5 Ws. The 5 Ws. Oh, people are saying them. Who, what, where, when, and why. Everyone's like, yeah, we're floating back to like middle school English all of a sudden. We're like, oh. But you can actually solve a lot of challenges with the text if you ask simply those questions. Now, some people will, well, how does this apply? You think in terms of, well, let's just go with who? Well, in a text, what is being asked when you say who? Okay, who's the author? And who's the intended recipient? Okay, for an example, well, give me an example, Grover. I'll put you on the spot. See, that's what you get for answering.
The Apostle Paul speaking to the people in Ephesus.
Okay, so you have an author, Paul, writing to the Ephesians in Ephesus. Now, is it limited to that, just that author and recipient, or is there more to it? Well, he's not just Paul, he's an inspired apostle, so it's Christ through him, and it's not just the Ephesians, so it has a general principle that carries forward to all Christians, but if we're looking at the text and you're trying to keep it there, those two are important. So that's a good example. Dawn, did you have one, or did I cut you off?
Well, I mean, we talked about Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay.
That's within the Gospels, but he was talking to people who were following him all over the country.
Okay, and so it's him speaking as one with authority, as it's stated, to an audience. Now we say, okay, who is his audience? Well, they're predominantly Jews, if not all of them, because of the location he's in. And then you can start to ask the questions. Okay, so you have the who's down. That actually can limit a lot of stuff. That's going to become important with the text we're going to look at. The who is actually a limiting factor because it helps you to focus on the conversation that's happening, the communication that's happening. We are always reading someone else's mail. I like to say that a lot, but it's true. It has application to us, but what people get in trouble with biblically and with Bible studies, they really try to force them into it as opposed to gleaning from it to apply to them. Application is different than interpretation, okay? So that's the who's. So an example, author, and this is, I'm writing on glass, so it probably doesn't look the best, and recipient. Okay, who? How about the what? What does the what describe in a context? I mean, that can be a lot of things, but. Okay, the subject. Yeah, the content. Okay, so are we talking about Paul to the Ephesians? Are we talking about how to walk, like this morning? Are we talking about a Sermon on the Mount? Simple truths with huge, deep potential for life, how to live one's life. The Sermon on the Mount is very simple language with incredible depth about the godly life. So the subject. Oh. Yep. Yes, and will that have any influence perhaps on what is said and how it's said, perhaps? It can. Sometimes it comes down to what is not said. Now, you want to be very careful of arguing from silence, but sometimes the things that are missed can speak in a way. Okay, who, what, the where. We're just going to go with location, but this can also arguably fit in terms of culture. It can fit in terms of, it's not just they're in this city. This is a city of X persons, so their particular attitudes, their particular preconceptions, their particular prejudices will come into play. Okay? Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh. Why? And there's a where element to that. It's a where. Yeah, so there's that. When is similar to that, and most of the time, time. That's kind of obvious, but is it?
Well, it could be, the where and the when could also come into the political climate of
Yes, it
that
can.
time,
It can.
or the social climate of that time.
Mhm.
There's a lot that can go into where.
The social and this, and again, this starts to get a little deeper, and if you're not familiar with what's going on necessarily, these questions can be a little harder to pick up, but there are also things to kind of have in the back of your mind if you're not sure of, okay, maybe there's some significance when I'm reading that fits a particular time, and there's an importance to that. I mean, biblically, there are basically 3 different epochs or dispensations is the term that's used. What are the 3 dispensations biblically? The patriarchal, which would be what? Time before the Mosaic Law, basically. It's arguably from Adam on. Abraham is focused upon as being like that one of the patriarchs, but even Job, who is either maybe a contemporary of Abraham, even before him, he has his sons as priests. It's an era where God interacted with man more directly, and the eldest son was usually the priest and so forth. And that actually carries forward even past Isaac, Jacob, up until the giving of the law. They were continuing that. Then you have the Mosaic, which is an interesting one because the Mosaic is kind of a sub one, sitting on top of the patriarchal in a way, because for the rest of the world, the Gentile world, it was kind of stayed the patriarchal. Mosaic was that unique covenant with a unique people in a unique time, not intended for everyone. And then what's the third dispensation? The church, where everything and everyone moves into that. A lot of times we tend to think in the two, and we think Old Testament, New Testament. Testament is the worst word for that. Old Covenant and New Covenant is better. It is just stuck as a tradition. But those three different epochs or dispensations, when you find yourself or the text you're reading, can be very important because that can determine certain things that God is asking for, right? People confuse this all the time. The when question is a huge thing. There are a lot of people that want to apply, for instance, things in Exodus or things in Leviticus to the Christian age that don't carry over. People try to seek authority in those things. Entire religious organizations, such as the Mormons, are built upon trying to claim the priesthood of Aaron and Melchizedek and all this stuff, and it's a total misunderstanding of the way time and things were built. So time is important, right? It can also come into play just with knowing when is something going on. You know, it's like, is this king alive yet? Is this other person, you know, there's a lot of factors. The one that's interesting and catches us a lot of the time, because it's in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John, the Gospels, what dispensation are those not necessarily written under, because they're written later, but what time are they describing? It's still the old law. It's the transition. Jesus is preparing for the coming kingdom. He's preparing for something better. He's preparing the people, but he's still under the old law. And he will still follow it, which answers certain questions like, why was he baptized? Well, God called for it, but he had no sins to be forgiven. It was something called for the males, or the men and women, I suppose, of the Jewish nation to do the thing. He'd do the thing. If he didn't, it wouldn't fulfill the command of God. So that sometimes that's easily forgotten. Jesus will talk about some things that will apply later. Matthew 18 with church discipline is one that's really a big one that comes to mind. And he's preparing certain things, but the people are still, so there's that transition going on. Okay, why? Why is actually sometimes the biggest question. It's similar to what? The what is the subject, and the why is the motivation. Or sometimes it is the kernel or the theological importance. That's a really fancy way of putting it. It's the meaning, it's the underlying purpose for why something is being recorded. There are a lot of things that have happened in history. There are a lot of things that happened in Bible history. Not all of them are recorded. What we have is what were recorded because it needed to be. And transcending from what to why is a big deal. Because that's where you can take something that's removed in time. And the one book that I've used and that we studied, and I'll steal from, well, you wouldn't know if I stole from them. It'd just be my idea. No. They use this idea of an interpretive bridge. It's the idea that you're taking from the text to you, and you have to bridge over some things. And there's not a problem with that. Time has passed, culture has passed, but sometimes you need a couple bridges. So if it's in the Old Testament, sometimes you have to bridge it over, okay, a principle under the old law. Okay, how would this apply under Christianity? You bridge it over to that, then you bridge it over to yourself. But those why questions, you can apply things that don't necessarily, the what doesn't necessarily apply to you anymore, but the why can be pretty powerful. The what in David and Goliath, for instance. Are we going to go out there, swords in hand, and cut some dude's head off? I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, life can get weird. Who knows? But is that likely in our time? in our Christian walk? Is that our mission? So how do we relate to a David who says, I'm going to win, I'm going to defeat this person? How do we relate to him? That's the what. It's the why. Why can we relate to David? God was with him, and he found strength in that. And he trusted in God in the victory. Now, if you carry the victory over into a different form, the general principle still carries forward. Matt? Okay. So overcoming your giant, your impossible foe, and so forth. What we're basically describing there is the difference between interpretation and application. People misuse and conflate those terms all the time. A text has how many interpretations? One. One. Are there times when some are a little less clear than others? Occasionally, yes, and we can have a few little questions over which way to take it. Is it over anything that's of salvation importance? No. There is a singular interpretation. However, from that meaning that the author intended, there are countless applications. If you can carry in keeping it in its intended form, you carry the principle over. What people say a lot of time when they say interpretation is they mean application. Okay? And the importance between the two is key, because you end up going and you'll study with people, you'll interact with them. A common thing with having come from Utah, the favorite of the Mormons, their elders, is to say, well, the Bible's correct as long as it's interpreted correctly. I'm like, it's not up to you to decide how it's interpreted. That's okay. Different interpretations of X. No. What they're doing is either they're stretching it or they're trying to apply it incorrectly, is what's going on. There's one interpretation, what it says. Now, different literature has different forms. And that's another question sometimes to ask, because we got the 5 W's there, and I filled the page with that. And this can fit with the what. I don't want to throw it in there, but what type of literature are you reading? Is it poetry? Is it gospel? Is it narrative? Is it a homily or a sermon? Hebrews is arguably a sermon instead of a letter, believe it or not. So is Ecclesiastes. Is it history? Gospel is kind of this weird blend of history, parable, poetry. It's all of them put together, because gospel is all defined, is shaped by the author, inspired to be shaped toward a directed realization of Jesus as Christ. John says that pretty plainly. But they're focused on that particular goal. So it's not giving X happened, Y happened, Z happened, like a history without context. It's these things. Anyway, I've gone through this introduction a little longer than I intended. That's okay. Let's look at this text then. Okay? And let's apply the five W's to this. This is 2 verses. I've kind of ripped it up from the context in Matthew 10. We can stick within that context there. But just that first question, who? Who is speaking? Okay, Christ is speaking. Okay, so I'm going to put C for Christ, and he's speaking to whom contextually? The disciples. So is he speaking to the general crowds? And that is correct. And it's, to be fair, you have to go back to, actually more specifically, back in verse 5, it's the 12 apostles, so not the general disciples. Disciples can be a general term for many of his followers. There were the 70, there were just general ones around. This is actually focused on the 12 even, so I'm going to change that D to an A and make it more specific to the apostles. Okay? So it's not something he's saying to the crowds, which is important. When he's speaking on the Sermon on the Mount, it's to the general people. He's speaking in terms of living one's general life. But here he's focusing on the apostles, okay? who, what, or who, what, did I do those in that particular order? Did I go out of order? Yeah, who, what. I'll just lay out, and you can read through it, and if you want to argue this with me, please do. The general purpose of this is preparing them to be sent out for a particular purpose. It's typically called the limited commission, as opposed to the general or the Great Commission in Matthew 28 to all Christians to go out and so forth. This was a very specific time, told the 12 to go into a very specific work in a specific place with specific parameters. This would be around, Mark records it as well, if it's the same event, because there are multiple ones actually, he goes back to Nazareth, and this is around Galilee. They're sent out by two to go and to perform miracles and to do various things. There's kind of hints here also as to not just what will occur in this particular event in this time, but maybe what will happen to the apostles later, because not all of this comes to be. But the what is preparing them with certain instructions. And it's going to include things like, not acquiring money. They're going to heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons, so they're going to perform miracles. That's back in verse 8. They're going to preach. They're not going to take any provisions with them. If a village takes them in, you stay. If they refuse them, if they refuse them to heed their words, they shake the dust off their feet and they move on. So there's a lot of little commands like this. And then we run into this idea, beware of men. Verse 17, they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you. You'll be brought before governors and kings for my sake. So this is starting to maybe talk a little more future as to what would happen to them eventually too. But has he started talking to anyone other than the apostles yet? No. So he's narrowing this. That right there has already put some constraints on our text, application-wise. Some of the other questions are pretty easy to go through. Where? I already said it's Galilee. I think it's in that region. Could be Judea, but Galilee, they're doing that work. When? It's in the 1st century. During the ministry of Christ. Why? So they would not be unprepared for their immediate job. They have Christ is not leaving them unprepared or unequipped. If this is going to carry over into their future work eventually as apostles, after Pentecost, they're going to remember this, and Matthew is going to pen it as a reminder too. But again, is it a promise? Well, I guess I should use that word. He is presenting them with, well, let's look at the text. When they hand you over, do not worry, and handing over to governors, hostile forces. When they hand you over, do not worry about how or what you are to say, for it will be given to you in that hour what you are to say. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. Okay? This seems to be a promise, right? Telling them not to be fearful, first off, but to be aware that they're not going to have to worry about what they're going to say. So if we go through here, we highlight they, you, and then your Father and you. I might have missed one in there. I'm going to box they, and the yous are all underlined. They is defined as the governors and kings he talked about in the early verse. The you, we decided, is the apostles. So this little promise here, the Spirit is going to give you words to speak. Don't worry about what you are to say when you face a challenge. Is that a general promise that applies to every Christian?
Obviously, it's a miraculous intervention.
Okay.
Don't even bother studying for the test. The answer's appropriate.
Okay. If it's specifically for them, why do people try to apply this today? Because they do. You're just getting into the motivations and various things there. This, I'm not trying to go down the road too far of, Latter-day, I mean, you've got your charismatics, that are gifts people. But in the church even, this is shown up from time to time. At Bear Valley, we had a student that came from a congregation that believed this principle. If you pray, the Spirit will give you what you are to say. It kind of surprised me. He was given that understanding, asked to give a 15, 20, 30-minute talk to several hundred teens at a youth rally, and he didn't prepare because the Spirit was going to tell him what to say. And he found out real quick that wasn't how that worked. But it came not just from this text, but texts like this from this. But Jesus is saying, when they hand you over, do not worry how you are to say. It will be given to you in that hour. It is not you who speak, the Spirit of your Father that works. He's saying that you will receive this. Where's the disconnect? Where's the disconnect when someone reads this? To whom was it spoken and for what purpose? Very simple questions. Very simple things. To us, we kind of go, well, duh. But at the same time, it's really easy to miss that.
I have heard people say before they don't know how to talk to somebody that's not a Christian that is asking them questions. They don't know how to answer those questions.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard several times, you just need to study the Bible, do what you do, and when you encounter those people, you'll know what to say because you studied the Bible and you know what God's Word is, but they still disconnect that. You're not going to be given the magic words of that.
No.
It's not magic.
No. And that particular, to be honest, and not to be critical, that particular answer that, well, if you study, you'll have the information, does not automatically mean that you're in a position to synthesize that information and share it. That comes with practice. That comes with, not everyone is suited to that, frankly. A good way to learn that is to be a silent partner with someone else when you're doing a study and watch what that other person does, who's experienced. Another thing, too, is a lot of times, people may not be able to answer the particular question, but you know what you can do? You can write it down and try to find an answer for it for the person who does. And you can say, well, I may not know that particular thing, but I can tell you what I did and why I became a Christian and what was a part of my life. Every Christian should be at least able to say what motivated them to make that choice. If they can't, that opens up a whole other problem. Now, it may not be easy to share. It might be something very, very emotional. But you're right. But there is this thought, it's like, well, that's, I guess, the other extreme. Well, if you study, you'll automatically, no.
Isn't it like later we learn in the epistles about gifts, and there's a lot of confusion about that as well.
Certainly.
Abilities that we have are developed, and the responsibilities are there, the commitments are there to accomplish the work, to seek out, carry the gospel. But the ability to do that in different arenas differs with individuals.
It differs with individuals.
Not everybody is equipped, no matter how hard they study, to handle certain kinds of things in certain kinds of ways.
Certainly, and not everyone is equipped to handle things in the same way, which is part of the body model. We're designed that way. We're not all a foot, we're not all a hand, we're not all an eye. Paul makes that point.
Some people try to make everybody responsible for doing everything.
No, certainly, and that's a mistake. And I'm going to be, just a second, how do I say this kindly? I guess what you're supposed to say is bless their heart, and then you can get away with saying anything you want, right? Is that how that works? There was a kind of well-intentioned, very aggressive, crass, kind of rough lady in California. Big heart. She can answer all kinds of Bible questions. I would not take her door knocking because her personality was so combative as such that she couldn't handle the calm, if that makes sense. And that's just an example of someone who's not suited to that particular thing. But she had other things. And I'm not trying to pick on her. It's just someone that came to mind. There's lists of gifts that were miraculous in the first century in 1 Corinthians 12. Those have been done away with. But Romans 12 is a mixed list with talents and gifts, some miraculous, some not. He talks about giving. Did you know giving is a gift? If someone is very good at being a success in the worldly standards and he has a lot, or she has a lot, to whom is given much, much is expected. Their talent is to, like a Barnabas, be generous. There are different things that different people can do. Robert?
You were mentioning, train of thought's been derailed.
Oh, it's my fault.
Go ahead, I'll figure it out in a minute.
Okay. So another thing you can do, looking at text, notice I highlighted the persons. They, you, I, it's not in it, but if that was there. You can also, something that's good to do with the text, is you look at particular words that might stand out. And an example, I'll just use this form, worry, say. Say doesn't seem like a complicated word, but given this context, since it's got a miraculous form to it, some might think, well, maybe this is some special meaning of say. So you want to make sure it's not that. It's not. It's actually what you're speaking. Worry. Worry cares. And what you could do is then take those words in a concordance or a Bible dictionary and dig into if there's something there that's standing out. But I don't know. This was an example of a case where if you are not careful with your particular context, you can run to some very interesting conclusions. I have a few like that. And a couple might upset some people if you're, because there's some different things. So the point of this is you can diffuse, or that's not the best way to put it. You can dig into something that might be a, quote, more difficult passage if you, common sense, ask the questions that you would of most every other thing that's hard to figure out in your life, frankly. And I'm not trying to lessen it, but who, what, where, when, why? What is the purpose of all this? Here's another question. Okay, because there's a temptation here to go in the other direction. Fine. This is Jesus speaking to his apostles. Okay, that has nothing to do with me. I don't even need to read it. Well, Matthew recorded it. Why did he record it? If it doesn't have direct application to you, if I'm not going to be able to have magic spiritual words given to me, then what is it, what purpose, what is the application? Where's the bridge for me? What's the general principle we can glean from this promise?
One thing is we can learn that one way or another, God equips us for our service.
Okay.
Somehow.
Okay. We are not forgotten. Our form of equipping may not be as direct as this, but those same people to whom he gave the very words to speak, penned the very words we read that are the very source of information we need. That kind of rhymed. That was unintentional, but kind of cool. God takes care of his followers. Jesus is not going to put his followers, in this case the 12, when he sends them out without money, without provision, without care, he's not sending them to the wolves without being with them or providing them what they need to know. In this case, God supplied the words because they hadn't been revealed yet. Right? And again, this was still that transition time. The church hadn't quite come yet. So the message that they're presenting, they're out preaching. They're still preaching preparation for the coming kingdom, not the kingdom itself. They didn't have a book to follow at the time. In the early church, that's what spiritual gifts filled the gap with. They didn't have the inspired words to follow. We knew in part and prophesy in part, 1 Corinthians 13 says. But when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. Anyway, I kind of rolled with this text a little while. Let's see. Let's do. Look at the clock. Let's do one more. Also in Matthew. This one. Oh, I'm seeing people grin. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Okay, I'm going King James. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. This is the sermon. Oh, boy, you should be figuring this out. Okay, who's the who here? Who's the who here? And it's not Horton. He's not seeing one. Yes?
Jesus talking to the crowd.
Okay. It's Jesus to, I'm going to put P for, well, I'll just write out the public. This is public consumption. This is the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. Except for like a little bit at the end of chapter 7 and beginning of 5. If it's in Matthew 5 through 7, it's the Sermon on the Mount. Shorthand. It's those 3 chapters. Bam. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. So this opens it up. This isn't focusing on a particular group of persons. This is more of a general life information. This applies to everyone. Okay, that actually unbounds a little bit. So who, what? Well, this particular piece of it is talking about judgments. Well, what word? I mean, I'll just say it. Judge and judgment, or judge and judge stand out. What does he mean by judge?
The context means don't be a hypocrite and practice the sin that you condemn.
Yes.
That's the context.
Okay. You're talking about this context business, but it's much easier for me to take this one statement and then use it all the time to my own devices, right?
It's like taking the Bible, put a bunch of scissors to it, and taking down what you want, and words, and phrases, and make it say anything.
In Matthew 7, well, if you take the verses, and this is the thing, or eliminate the verses, eliminate the chapter headings. What is your context? Well, the entire thing's going to be the Sermon on the Mount. If you want to dial it into here's your fancy word for the day, okay? You can use this in your next meeting. Pericope. Pericope. It's the minimum necessary number of verses or words to establish the full thought of the context. The pericope. So it could take a chapter, it could take half a chapter. That's your fancy term. I don't know if I've ever really used it. It's one of those. But before this, he's talking about worry. Right before this verse is that end in chapter 6 where he's talking about the lilies of the field and the grass and the birds of the sky. And he's talking about don't worry about tomorrow. Each day has enough trouble of its own. It's the last thing, each day has enough trouble of its own. Then he says, do not judge so that you will not be judged. Did he just completely change thoughts? Or are they connected in some way?
The full thought is not there. The full context is not there.
Well, you could say he shifted, because he does shift from some different subjects. So one argues, okay, he's moved from where he's talking now, because he's going to continue. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and your standard of measure, and so forth. Oh, wait, I just went into verse 2. He talks about, do not judge, and then he talks about the way you judge. Well, isn't that a contradiction, Jesus? You just said not to do something, and then you're talking about, well, the way you do it. Well, it's not going to matter the way I do it if I'm not supposed to do it. Oh. Oh, is what he's saying, is it a total, careful how I deal with this. Is he prescribing an entire lack of making any judgment of any kind in life whatsoever? No. What is he focusing on? Okay, so I guess that's more the why. We've kind of jumped to the why. What is he getting at? What is the purpose of it all? Well, how does it fit with hypocrisy? Okay. The way you judged, you will be judged. Your standard measure will be measured to you. He gives the example of the speck in your brother's eye with the log in your own, which is a ridiculous appeal to hyperbole. He does it from time to time. He gives an extreme, silly example. Why are you picking, well, are you prepared is maybe the best way to pick at the speck in your brother's eye if you got a log sticking out of your own. Now, some have taken that to mean, yeah, be careful what you do, and it's the hypocrite thing. Is he stating not to ever help? Does he say not to take the speck out? What does he say to do? Oh,
I basically think, using it in context, that he's letting people know that he's in charge. He's going to take care of you. You don't have to do this because I'm going to take care of it. A little bit before about the words and after it, where he says that he can be and all the other stuff. And I think he's in charge.
well, that is true. But is he saying not to try to help someone else if they have a speck in their eye? Because later on he says, you hypocrite, verse 5, first take the log out of your own eye. Okay, take care of yourself, and then you will see clearly to do what? To take the speck out of your brother's eye. He's not prohibiting. Be careful with this. He's not, and judgment is an interesting term that's there. He's not prohibiting trying to confront your fellow man, your fellow woman, with the problems that they have. He's not prohibiting that. He's prohibiting the hypocrisy that goes with creating a standard that's not godly. Holding a standard up to others that you will not measure up to yourself. If you're in the position to take care, if you have looked at yourself with introspection, it's like Galatians 1, if you're going to one who's committed an offense, do so and be careful. So then you are in a best position to take care of what. But he never says, because he says that you'll be able to take the speck out. He actually speaks of doing it. That's an action.
And that's even greater emphasized if you go back to 6:33 where he says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And then he says all these things will be added to you. Don't be worried. Every day has enough trouble for its own. And then he goes into, we're going to have problems. We're going to be judged. We're going to want to judge. But if we're seeking the righteousness of God first and his kingdom, then we'll examine ourselves before we start examining everybody else.
Certainly, you'll look to yourself. And again, it comes down to the thing of ultimately, you're not the one making the judgment. Gina, did you? Okay. Matt?
That's what we say, worry about yourself, not someone else, and leave that to God. It's just God's to ultimately judge. It's not our place to do that.
It just enters into the question of if someone is doing something sinful. Okay? How do you confront that? You confront that in love. If they ask you, do you think this is right or not? Do you avoid the question? And that, there's the old canard, the old statement, judge the sin, not the sinner, which is a truism, but it's an abused aphorism too. The reason this one made everyone grin is because this is used against Christians all the time by the world to live and let live. They're saying that's a live and let live, I'm okay, you're okay, morally relative philosophy. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Actually, go down to verse 6. He says, do not give what is holy to dogs. Do not throw your pearls before swine. Well, how do you know if something is a dog or a swine without making a judgment about it? That describes a judgment call in how we're choosing to behave. It necessarily requires one. John, he will say, and it's a different context, but he will make the statement, making righteous judgments. Well, how can you make righteous judgments if you don't make them? And again, this term sometimes is thrown around, and it's good to try to define it a little bit too. There's a difference between discernment, decision-making, making a choice between A and B, and sitting in authority and claiming to be the one that knows what's right, or that vengeance is mine, says the Lord.
Is there some sense in which sometimes the original understanding of phrasing in the original language may carry meanings that don't come through in the translation?
Oh, certainly.
It makes it easier to understand if we had.
Oh, certainly. Oh, certainly. There's one of the others I'm going to hold on to because of time that really fits that well. But yeah, that is true. There is debate over, And again, if we were to go to this one to the nth degree, you probably want to do a word study on what the original term in Greek is being translated as judge. But it is, if I remember correctly, it's not a word that's as different as you might think. It's interesting that he begins this, do not judge that you will not be judged. From the way you judge, you will be judged, and your standard measure will be measured to you. It's much like, the way you forgive others is how you'll be forgiven. It all comes back to that which we give, we receive. And it's better to not judge than to make a bad judgment. But the temptation becomes, okay, the world will just be the world. I'm going to be me. I'm going to cloister myself off or hide myself off and never confront anything. And that actually is not a biblical idea. He's talking about taking care of yourself, making sure to keep yourself in check, and that, look to yourself first. And this is, I'm hearing this myself too. This is a very difficult thing for people who are in a public position, especially, or church leadership or those kind of things. Look to yourself, have the right heart before you confront others.
I think also that, when we think of judging, we think of judging each other's sins.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it doesn't quite apply to just sins.
No.
If I am a hurting person and I realize that I'm hurting and I'm trying to deal with that pain and that hurt wherever it comes from, it makes it easier for me that I've acknowledged that hurt to see it in others and know when they're hurting and be able to support them and go, I've been there, I know how bad it hurts, and I can see you're hurting, what can I do to help?
Okay. So experience can present a better eye toward empathy and sympathy, which are two different but similar things, certainly.
And in a way, that's casting a judgment to have
To discern this person is probably, what you're doing is you're making an assessment. Just be careful. Part of it is be careful about making snap or quick assessments. You're assessing that something is a certain situation. Find out information. You ask questions, certainly. Well, you want to relate this to maybe not a sin-based one. I think this scenario in Romans 14, where you have the weak and the stronger brethren. The weaker brother is described as someone who has a certain biblical, a certain belief that if they do X, it'll violate their conscience, that God hasn't stipulated on. Meat sacrifice to idols was the first century example, but there are some 21st century ones in the church we can come up with. And Paul's command is to not create a scenario where that weak brother is tempted to violate their conscience. Well, that means you have to know then, A, what they believe, where they're coming from, and how to behave in order to not do that, which requires a judgment.
But it also requires knowing that person.
Knowing them too, and a discernment, and not making it about you. That's what it gets back to. We're not actually going to be finding ourselves in a, quote, judging position quite as often if we're looking to ourselves more. We're going to be more ready to help each other with with the challenges. The person you're trying to get the speck out of their eye wants your help because you've demonstrated that you've shown a heart that cares about such things instead of going, ha ha, Matt, that speck is ridiculous. Wow.
Also, you've shown that if you can deal with the love that's in your eye, you've shown some area of understanding in how to remove that, so that person can look to you and say, hey, since you've handled this
Yep.
before, I could use your help too, since you've already conquered that.
Okay. Yeah, no, they're in a position to have done it. Here's the thing. When I put this text up, and we'll wind out here, the reaction was everyone smirked because you knew where some people take this. There's still a lot of debate over where exactly the lines, but the principles carry forward. And he talks about various things. It's more than just verse 1 is the point. And asking these questions, who? This is a general principle. What? It's talking about how to interact with our fellow man and our brothers and sisters especially. When? Well, this is This was during the first century, so it's under the old law, but he's looking forward, the Sermon on the Mount's looking forward to the coming kingdom. So it has a Christian element. But why? Why is the question is, why does he bring this up? Who are the people that are the most in danger of being hypocrites? Is it the world? It's God's people. What does hypocrite mean? I mean, there's the English definition, but biblically, what does it mean? I see a lot of people going, well, okay. The original term, again, we stole it. It's hypokrisis in Greek. We, again, were lazy and made up a new word. Hypokrisis. Literally means to wear a false face. Coming from the stage, where a lot of times they had a limited number of actors, so they would play multiple parts. And so you knew who they were. They'd put the mask of the villain and the mask of the hero. That's where the theater mask concepts originally came from, actually. It's the idea of putting on a face of an actor.
What we might call being two-faced.
It's two-faced, yeah, no, exactly. You're putting on a false face. Now, in a weird way, and I did a sermon on this that made people raise their eyebrows and they got kind of mad at me until I kind of explained it. Theoretically, in a way, Christians should be hypocrites in the sense that we aren't presenting our own face, we're presenting whose? Christ's. But in this case, we're talking about a false face. We're all recovering hypocrites. But he's saying, guys, dial it back. Be very careful. Watch yourselves. See what happened to God's people? He's talking to the Pharisees in his day. They had good intentions. The Pharisees started with good intentions. They wanted to teach things so that the Jewish youth of the day wasn't corrupted by the evil Greek influences. It's just they turned it into something more than it was ever supposed to be. The way to hell is paved with good intentions. Be careful. And see, it's more than just this little pithy statement. It's a powerful statement that's part of a larger context. Anyway, it's about 6. So this was kind of an experimental kind of thing. We're having some discussion, having some fun. Probably come back to it again next month about the same time with a couple more. That was fun. Any thoughts? We approach things a little, expand on some different things. Okay. Is there anyone that didn't get an opportunity to partake the Lord's Supper this morning? I think all of us were here that I see. Not seeing any hands. Okay. Is there anything else to mention before we close then? Okay. Well, if not, Matt, would you close us in prayer? Would that be okay?